The freight train groaned as it slowed through the lonely station at Copper Gulch, a weather-beaten stop on the edge of the Dakota Prairie. It was late May in 1872, and the afternoon sun hammered down on the platform with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the iron rails stretching toward the horizon. The station itself was little more than a tilting shed, with a sagging roof, 3 benches worn smooth by waiting bodies, and a water tower that leaked rust into the parched earth below. A young woman in torn clothes hurled herself off the last freight car. She hit the wooden boards hard, knees first, then palms, and skidded through grit and splinters. Her skirt caught under her boots and ripped further, revealing petticoats stained with dirt and blood. The impact tore open the skin on her knees, dark red blooming against pale flesh. One eye was swollen nearly shut, bruised the color of a storm cloud. Her hair, once pinned in a neat arrangement, now hung in matted tangles around her shoulders, catching splinters as she slid. Men shouted behind her on the moving train. A railroad enforcer in a bowler hat leaned out from the car's open door, reaching for her with a gloved hand. "Get back here, girl." His voice was sharp, angry, cutting through the screech of iron wheels. "You signed the contract. You hear me. Your property." The woman did not look back. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for air that burned her lungs, and staggered toward the far edge of the platform. Her legs shook with exhaustion. She had been hiding in that freight car for hours, maybe longer time, blurring into one long stretch of terror and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. On the platform, a tall Lakota man waited alone, a canvas bundle of supplies at his feet. Wicasa, called Tall Bear by his own people, stood in worn buckskin leggings and a plain shirt the color of sand, faded from many washings. His moccasins were stitched with small blue beads, in a pattern that spoke of careful hands, practical and unadorned. Long black hair hung down his back, tied with a simple beaded band, and a single eagle feather that caught the light. His face was broad-weathered by 30 winters of wind and sun, and his eyes were dark and steady, missing nothing. He saw the woman stumble. She was aiming for the edge of the platform, but her heel caught on a loose plank that jutted up like a broken tooth. Her body pitched forward, arms flailing for balance that would not come. The enforcer lunged from the moving car boots, scraping iron fingers, grasping air. The train was still rolling, picking up speed again, as it prepared to leave the station behind and continue its westward journey. The woman's legs gave out completely. She pitched sideways toward the iron rails, one hand reaching out to catch herself on nothing but air, and approaching death. In one swift motion, Wicasa stepped forward. He hooked his arm around her waist and yanked her back hard, spinning them both away from the edge. The momentum carried them in a half circle. The train thundered past, hot wind slamming into them with the force of a physical blow, grit stinging their faces and filling their mouths with the taste of ash and coal smoke. The enforcer cursed and pulled himself back inside the car as it roared away, his voice lost in the clatter of wheels on steel and the long, mournful wail of the whistle. The woman collapsed. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen to the boards if Wicasa had not eased her down, guiding her weight. He lowered himself to sit on the sun-baked platform, back braced against the rough planks of the depot wall, and steadied her as she shook like a wounded animal caught in a trap. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps that bordered on sobs, but did not quite cross that line. Dust settled slowly around them, golden motes dancing in the slanting afternoon light. The train grew smaller in the distance, a black line against the gold horizon where prairie met sky in an endless sweep of emptiness. Voices rose around them, rough and curious and hostile. A man in a stained vest shouted from the depot doorway, his face red with heat and something else. "Hey, that Lakota just stole Dan's girl." Another voice, sharper, belonging to a rail worker in canvas trousers. "Someone fetch the sheriff. We got a situation here." Wicasa did not move. He sat on the empty platform, one hand resting lightly on the woman's shoulder, not restraining, just steadying. She clutched at his shirt fingers, digging into the fabric with the strength of desperation, and pressed her face against his chest as if she could disappear into the shelter of his body and escape the world that had brought her to this moment. He looked down at her for a long moment, taking in the bruises, the torn clothing, the way her whole body trembled. Then he looked up at the gathering crowd, his expression calm and unreadable as stone, and waited for what would come next. The rails stretched away into the distance, 2 lines of gleaming iron that had brought this woman to him, and that would, in the days to come, lead them both into danger and something that might, if they survived, be called justice. Copper Gulch sat between Lakota hunting grounds to the north and the new rail line that snaked west toward Thunder Valley, carrying freight and passengers, and more often than anyone wanted to admit, human cargo that was never recorded in the company ledgers. The town itself was a collection of rough buildings thrown together in the past 5 years since the first survey crew had driven stakes into the hard ground and declared this spot suitable for a station. There was a saloon with peeling paint and a false front that made it look grander than it was a general store that sold everything from flour to firearms at prices that made farmers wince. A smithy, where the clang of hammer on anvil rang out from dawn to dusk, a tiny church that doubled as a schoolhouse and saw more use for the latter than the former, and a row of cramped shacks where miners and drifters slept off their wages before starting the cycle again. The streets were packed dirt rutted by wagon wheels and baked hard as stone by the summer sun. When the wind blew, which was often, it carried dust and the sharp smell of creosote from the rail ties stacked near the depot waiting to be laid down in the endless push westward. The air tasted of distance and dryness. And at night, the temperature dropped so fast that men who had been sweating at sunset were shivering by midnight. In practice, the town was ruled by 2 men who had come west with the railroad and stayed to carve out their own empires. The first was disloyal Dan Crow, a smooth-talking saloon owner with slicked hair the color of wet coal and a smile that never reached his eyes. He wore a black vest over a white shirt, always clean, despite the dust that coated everything else, and kept a small derringer tucked in his boot where it would not show but could be drawn fast. The second was Sheriff Crooked Miles, a broad-shouldered man with a drooping mustache and a badge he wore like a private business license, enforcing the law when it suited Dan, and looking the other way when it did not. Miles had a reputation for being handy with a gun, and had killed 3 men in duels that everyone agreed were fair, though no one could quite explain why all 3 had been men who owed Dan money. Wicasa had lived on the edges of Copper Gulch for 3 years, ever since the rail line had pushed through and his band had scattered like leaves before a storm. Once he had been a respected warrior among his people, a man who rode with hunting parties that ranged for weeks across the plains, following buffalo herds that stretched to the horizon. He had spoken in council, his words carrying weight, because he had proven himself in battle and in the quiet times between battles when wisdom mattered more than strength. But the buffalo herds were shrinking, thinned by white hunters who killed for hides and left the meat to rot under the sun. The rail line cut through the heart of Lakota land, and the white men who followed it brought sickness whiskey and treaties written in ink that dried before the words could be trusted. Wicasa had watched his band scatter. Some went north to join Sitting Bull's people, who still resisted the encroachment with raids and defiance. Others tried to farm the land the government promised them, land that turned out to be barren and cursed with alkali water that killed crops and sickened livestock. His own family had died 5 winters ago, his wife and infant son taken by fever brought by traders. He had buried them on a hill overlooking the river and had not spoken their names since, as was proper. Wicasa stayed near Copper Gulch. He worked as a horse wrangler and occasional scout for the railroad, not out of loyalty to the company that was destroying his people's way of life, but to keep watch on the steel slicing through his people's land. He wanted to know where the trains went, what they carried, and who gave the orders. Information, he had learned, was a kind of weapon, perhaps the only weapon that might work when bullets and arrows had failed. He camped by the river with 2 friends, who had also been cast adrift by the changing world. Sven was a Swedish prospector with a limp from a mining accident years ago that had crushed his left leg and left it shorter than the right. He had a graying beard that reached halfway down his chest, kind eyes the color of winter sky, and a laugh that sounded like rocks tumbling down a hillside, rough but genuine. His wife Tallulah was Navajo quiet and sharp-eyed, with hands that could stitch beadwork so fine it looked like woven light, and a knowledge of herbs that made her the closest thing to a healer many people in Copper Gulch would ever see. She traded her work in town and gathered plants along the riverbank, selling remedies to anyone who would buy white or native, and asking no questions about why they needed what they needed. The three of them lived in a tilting line shack near an abandoned silver mine, a place most people had forgotten existed. The mine had played out years ago, yielding nothing but disappointment, and now the tunnels were dark and the timbers were rotting. It suited them fine. They had privacy water from the river and enough distance from town that they could pretend sometimes that the world was not changing as fast as it was. Now on the platform at Copper Gulch, Wikasa held a woman he did not know and tried to make sense of the shouting around him. He recognized most of the faces in the crowd. Rail workers' town drunks, a few honest farmers who had come in for supplies. None of them looked friendly. Dr. Kingsley pushed through the crowd, using his medical bag as a wedge. He was a tired man in his 50s, with thinning hair the color of old straw and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose because one arm had been bent years ago and never properly fixed. He carried a battered medical bag that had seen service in the Mexican War and bore stains that no amount of scrubbing would remove. He wore a coat that had seen better days threadbare at the elbows, and his hands shook slightly with the tremor that came to men who had seen too much suffering and drunk too much whiskey, trying to forget it. "Move aside," he said, his voice firm despite his appearance. "Let me see her." Wikasa did not let go, but he shifted his position so the doctor could kneel beside them on the boards. Kingsley examined the woman's face, his fingers gentle on her bruised eye, then checked the scrapes on her palms and knees. He pressed gently on her ribs through the torn fabric of her dress. She flinched and gasped a sharp intake of breath that spoke of pain deep in the bone. Cracked, maybe broken. Kingsley muttered to himself, though loud enough for Wikasa to hear. He looked up, meeting the Lakota's dark eyes. "Bring her to my office, carefully. Any rough handling could puncture a lung." Before Wikasa could move, a voice cut through the noise like a knife through cloth. "She stays right where she is." Sheriff Crooked Miles stepped onto the platform, boots heavy on the boards, each step deliberate and loud. Behind him came disloyal Dan, moving with the smooth confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on, and everyone standing on it. Dan smiled at the woman in Wikasa's arms, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Well, Rosalie, you gave us quite a scare jumping off a moving train like that. Could have killed yourself. Would have been a terrible waste." The woman Rosalie turned her head slowly to look at him. Her one good eye was full of cold, exhausted fury that burned brighter than any flame. Dan kept smiling, showing white teeth. "You signed a contract, honey. That makes you my responsibility until you get where you're going. Now let's get you cleaned up and back on the next train. We've got people waiting for you in Thunder Valley." "No." The word came out hoarse, barely audible, but it was clear and carried the weight of absolute refusal. Dan's smile thinned, becoming something harder. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice in the matter. A contract is a contract. Law's the law." Wikasa looked at the sheriff. "She is hurt. She needs a doctor, not a train." Miles hooked his thumbs in his gun belt fingers close to the revolver that hung at his hip. "She's also a thief, according to the railroad company. Says she stole a ticket and damaged company property jumping off like that. You best hand her over Tall Bear before I arrest you for interfering with legal business." Wicasa studied the sheriff for a long moment, reading the man's stance, the position of his hands, the tension in his shoulders. Then he stood in one smooth motion, lifting Rosalie in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, bones sharp against his hands, through her torn dress. He turned and walked straight past Miles, past Dan, heading toward the doctor's office at the far end of the street. Miles called after him, voice rising with anger. "You're making a mistake, Lakota, a big one." Wicasa did not answer. Dr. Kingsley hurried to keep up, bag swinging at his side, and threw an apologetic glance back at the sheriff that meant nothing. Behind them, Dan watched with narrowed eyes that calculated odds and strategies. He leaned close to the sheriff and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Miles nodded slowly, hand still resting on the butt of his revolver, and his expression promised violence later, if not now. At the edge of the crowd, a woman in a plain blue dress and a bonnet that shaded her face watched the whole scene unfold with sharp attention. Her name was Edith, and she was the schoolteacher, a woman of 35, who had come west 5 years ago with ideals about educating frontier children, and had stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat. She had sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a sharper mind that missed very little. She did not like the look on Dan's face, the calculation there, the cruelty barely hidden. She made a mental note to visit Dr. Kingsley later, once the men had gone, and find out what this was really about. Dr. Kingsley's office was a cramped room attached to the back of the general store, accessible through a side door that stuck in its frame and required a hard shove to open. It smelled of carbolic acid, old blood, and dust that no amount of sweeping could fully banish. A narrow cot sat against one wall, covered with a thin blanket that had been washed so many times the original color was a mystery. A small desk sat against another wall, its surface covered with papers, bottles, and surgical instruments that gleamed dully in the lamplight. Shelves held jars of herbs with faded labels, rolls of bandages in various states of cleanliness, and a few precious bottles of medicine that Kingsley hoarded like gold. Wicasa laid Rosalie on the cot, with care easing her down so that the impact was minimal. She hissed in pain anyway, as her back touched the thin mattress, and her hands gripped the edges of the cot hard enough that her knuckles went white. Kingsley lit a kerosene lamp and set it on the desk, adjusting the wick until the flame burned steady and bright. Then he rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked with old scars. "Wait outside," he told Wicasa, his voice gentle but firm. Wicasa hesitated. Rosalie's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, fingers trembling but desperate in a way that made refusal impossible. "I don't leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please." Wicasa looked at the doctor. Kingsley sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "Fine, but stay by the door and keep quiet. I need to concentrate." Wicasa moved to the corner and leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Rosalie's eyes followed him, tracking his movements as if she were afraid he might vanish like smoke if she looked away. Kingsley worked quickly with the efficiency of long practice. He cleaned the scrapes on her knees and palms, dabbing away blood and dirt with cloth soaked in carbolic that made her flinch and bite her lip to keep from crying out. He examined the bruise around her eye, with gentle fingers pressing carefully on the bone beneath to check for fractures. He listened to her breathing, his stethoscope cold against her skin through the torn fabric, and frowned at what he heard. Then he wrapped her ribs with strips of clean linen, winding them tight enough to support, but not so tight she could not draw breath. "No fracture in the face?" he said after a while, speaking as much to himself as to her. "The ribs are cracked, at least 2 of them. You'll heal, but you need rest, real rest, and you need food." "How long since you ate?" Rosalie closed her eyes, trying to remember. Time had blurred. 2 days, maybe 3. I'm not sure. Kingsley reached into a cupboard and pulled out a tin of crackers and a jar of preserved peaches luxuries he kept for patients who needed them most. He opened both and set them on the edge of the cot within her reach. Eat slowly. Too much too fast, and you'll be sick, and that will hurt your ribs worse. Rosalie sat up with effort, moving like an old woman, and took a cracker. Her hands shook as she bit into it, and she chewed slowly, mechanically, as if eating were a task she had forgotten how to enjoy. A knock sounded at the door, hard and impatient. Kingsley opened it a crack, then wider, when he saw who it was. Sheriff Miles stood outside, and behind him, disloyal Dan. "We need to talk to the girl," Miles said, not asking, stating. "She's in no condition for interrogation." "Now, doctor." Kingsley stepped back reluctantly, knowing he had no real authority to refuse. Miles and Dan entered, filling the small room with their presence. Dan's eyes went straight to Rosalie, and his smile returned, though it was colder now. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice smooth as oil poured over water. Rosalie did not answer. She met his gaze with her one good eye and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Dan's smile did not waver. "Good. Now let's clear this up so there's no confusion. You came to Copper Gulch on a contract. I paid for your ticket from New York all the way across country. That's not cheap. I fed you, gave you a roof, gave you work. You owe me for that. The railroad company wants compensation for the damage you caused jumping off like that, and I intend to put you on the next train west. You'll work off your debt in Thunder Valley. Fair deal for everyone." Rosalie's voice was low but steady when she finally spoke. "You lied? The letters said I was coming to marry a rancher. Bartholomew Crow, your brother. That's what the advertisement said. That's what I agreed to." Dan shrugged, the gesture careless. "Bartholomew changed his mind. Happens all the time with these arrangements. Women don't look like their descriptions, or they've got bad habits, or they're just not suitable. So I found you other work. You should be grateful. Not every girl in your position gets a second chance. You made me scrub floors in a saloon while men grabbed at me like I was livestock for sale. You told me I had no choice, that you owned me until the debt was paid. You signed a contract. Your mark is on the paper. That's legally binding. I signed a marriage contract, not a contract to be sold like cattle from one man to another." Dan's expression hardened, the smooth surface cracking to show something uglier beneath. "Careful, honey. You're already in enough trouble. Don't make it worse by being difficult." Wicasa stepped forward from his position by the wall, drawing attention. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight that made both men turn to look at him. "She says she was deceived. If the contract was obtained through false pretenses, it does not bind her. That is true even under white law." Miles turned on him, eyes narrowing. "You don't have a say in this, Lakota. In fact, I could arrest you right now for kidnapping. Witnesses saw you take this woman against the will of her legal guardian. I saved her from falling under the train. Witnesses saw that too. That's not how the railroad sees it. They say you interfered with company business and helped a thief escape custody. And there's another matter we need to discuss." Miles pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and held it up for display. "A railroad camp was robbed last week. Tools Supply's cash box with 3 months' payroll. Witnesses say it was a Lakota raiding party. You fit the description they gave us." Wicasa's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "I was not there. I was scouting for the company 20 miles north. Your own records will show that. Records can be wrong, or maybe you did both. You people move fast when you want to." Silence filled the room, thick and tense. Dr. Kingsley cleared his throat, trying to diffuse the situation. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could discuss this at another time." "No," Dan said flatly. "We discuss it now." He stepped closer to the cot looming over Rosalie. Here's what's going to happen. Rosalie gets back on the train tomorrow morning when the westbound comes through. Tall Bear here keeps his nose out of white business and goes back to his horses. And we all forget this little misunderstanding. Simple, clean, everyone walks away. Rosalie reached into the torn pocket of her skirt, her hands shaking. She pulled out a creased piece of paper folded small and stained with sweat and dirt. She held it out to Wicasa with trembling fingers. "This is what they sent me." She said, her voice stronger now. "It proves what I'm saying. I came as a bride, not what they tried to make me." Wicasa took the letter and unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases. The handwriting was neat and formal, the kind taught in schools back east. It described a house with 4 rooms and a stone chimney land suitable for farming and grazing, a future with children and stability. The language was flowery, but specific, painting a picture of domestic peace that would appeal to a young woman with few options. At the bottom was a signature in bold ink, Bartholomew Crow. And beside it, embossed in faint blue ink that caught the lamplight, was a small emblem, a train engine surrounded by a circle with the words Thunder Valley Railroad beneath it in small letters. Wicasa stared at the emblem. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. He had seen it before. A year ago, he had tracked a wagon carrying Lakota children east, taken under the pretense of attending a school where they would learn to read and write and become civilized. The parents had agreed because they were desperate, because the buffalo were gone and their children were hungry. The wagon had borne the same emblem printed on papers the white men had waved, and on the side of the wagon itself, half hidden by mud. The children had never come back. No letters, no word. Just gone as if they had been swallowed by the earth. He looked up at Dan, seeing the man differently now. This is part of something larger, not just one woman lied to. A system. Dan's eyes went cold, and all pretense of friendliness dropping away. "You're imagining things, Lakota. That's a railroad emblem. The company handles lots of business. Doesn't mean anything." Wicasa folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Rosalie. "There is a federal marshal in Eagle's Nest, 2 days' ride west. He has been investigating rumors of trafficking tied to the railroad and the orphan trains that bring children west. If we can reach him with your testimony and this letter, it might be enough to crack the ring open and see what's inside." Miles laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You think you can just walk to Eagle's Nest? It's 2 days' ride through open country, and you'll be riding straight into the sun with no cover. I'll have a posse on you before you clear the town line. You'll be lucky to make it 5 miles. Wicasa met his gaze without flinching. "Then I will ride fast and hope luck is with me." Altar, Dan's voice dropped, losing all its smoothness and revealing the threat beneath. "If you take her, Tall Bear, you'll be a wanted man, not just among whites. Some of your own people already think you've sold out by working for the railroad, by taking their money and scouting their routes. This will confirm it. They'll call you traitor. You'll have nowhere to go, no one to turn to." Wicasa did not answer immediately. He looked at Rosalie, really looked at her, taking in the bruises and the exhaustion, the fierce determination in her expression, despite the pain she was clearly feeling. He thought about the children who had vanished, about his own wife and son taken by fever, brought by white traders, about all the ways the world had become smaller and meaner. "Can you ride?" he asked her directly. "I'll try. I'll have to." Kingsley stepped forward, his voice sharp with concern. "This is insane. She can barely walk. Her ribs are cracked. If she falls off a horse, she could puncture a lung and drown in her own blood." "She will not walk," Wicasa said calmly. "And she will not fall. She will ride with me, and I will make sure she is safe." Miles reached for his revolver, his hand closing around the grip. Wicasa moved faster, stepping between the sheriff and Rosalie, his own hand dropping to the knife at his belt. The blade was 9 inches of steel honed sharp, and he knew how to use it. For a long moment, no one moved. The room was frozen in tableau violence, hanging in the air like smoke. Then Kingsley spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen, this is a place of healing. If you want to settle your disputes, do it outside my office. I won't have bloodshed here." Dan laughed at the sound breaking the moment. "No need for bloodshed, Doctor. Not yet, anyway. Tall Bear knows what he's doing. He's choosing sides, and that's his right. A man's got to follow his conscience, even when it leads him off a cliff." He turned to the sheriff. "Let them go. They won't get far. We'll round them up by noon tomorrow, and then we'll have attempted escape and resisting arrest to add to the charges." Miles holstered his revolver slowly, his face flushed with anger. "You're a dead man, Lakota. You just don't know it yet." Wakasa did not flinch or respond. He turned to Rosalie. "We leave before dawn. Can you be ready?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Get some rest, eat. The doctor will watch over you until I return." He left through the side door, moving quietly into the gathering dusk. Behind him, he heard Dan and Miles leave through the front, their voices carrying threats and promises. He did not look back. The night was cool and full of stars, the sky so clear and vast it seemed to swallow the earth. Wakasa returned to the river camp, moving through darkness with the ease of long practice. He found Sven and Tallulah sitting by a small fire, cooking fish they had caught that afternoon. He told them what had happened, holding nothing back. They listened without interrupting, their faces serious in the firelight. When he finished, Sven scratched his graying beard and stared into the flames. "Dan Crow's got money and men. You're taking on a fight you can't win, my friend. Not straight up anyway." "Maybe," Wakasa said, sitting down across from them, "but I will not give her back to him. I have seen what men like Dan do. They take and they break and they throw away. Someone has to stand against it." Tallulah studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting firelight. "You think this woman is telling the truth? You don't know her. She could be lying, trying to escape debts she owes." "I saw her eyes," Wakasa said simply. "I have seen that look before, on the faces of children taken from my people, told they were going to school, but knowing somehow that they would never come home. That look does not lie." Tallulah nodded slowly, accepting his judgment. "If you are going to Eagle's Nest, you will need supplies, food, water, ammunition, and a good horse." Sven stood and limped into the shack, his bad leg dragging slightly. He came back with a rifle, old but well-maintained, the wood stock polished smooth by years of handling. He held it out along with a leather pouch full of cartridges. "Take this, and take Swift Elk. He's the fastest horse we've got, and he's got stamina. Won't quit on you even when he's tired." Wakasa gripped his friend's shoulder, feeling the strength still there despite age and injury. "Thank you, my friend. I will return them when I can." "See that you do," Sven said gruffly. "That rifle cost me 2 months' wages, and I'm fond of that horse." Tallulah packed dried meat hardtack and a canteen filled with water from the river. She added a small bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth. "For pain, make her chew the leaves. They're bitter, but they'll help with the ribs." Wakasa took everything and prepared quickly. He would rest for a few hours, then go into town before dawn and get Rosalie. After that, they would ride hard and hope that luck and skill were enough. Before dawn, when the sky was still dark but beginning to gray, at the eastern edge, Wakasa saddled Swift Elk. The horse was a strong paint, with a white blaze on its face and intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the urgency. He packed light, but carefully, blankets rolled tight, dried meat and hardtack in saddlebags, the canteen tied securely, the rifle in its scabbard within easy reach. Then he rode into Copper Gulch, moving quietly through streets that were still empty, his horse's hooves muffled in the thick dust. Kingsley had kept Rosalie in his office overnight, as much for her protection as for medical reasons. She was awake when Wicasa arrived, sitting on the cot with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had eaten more of the crackers and peaches, and there was a little more color in her face, though the bruises looked darker now, yellowing at the edges. "Can you ride?" Wicasa asked again, needing to be certain. "I have to. There's no other choice." He helped her stand, his hand under her elbow to steady her. She swayed slightly, but her legs held. Kingsley handed her a canteen filled with fresh water and a small bundle of clean bandages wrapped in paper. "Change the dressing on your ribs every day if you can. Keep the wounds clean. And don't do anything foolish, though I suspect that advice comes too late." Rosalie managed a faint smile, the first Wicasa had seen from her. "Too late by about 3 months, Doctor. But thank you. For everything." "Get out of here," Kingsley said gruffly, "before Miles wakes up and realizes you're gone." Outside, the sky was turning from gray to pale gold. Wicasa boosted Rosalie into the saddle, his hands careful on her waist, then mounted behind her. She stiffened at first, unused to the closeness, but when he wrapped one arm around her midsection to steady her, she relaxed slightly and leaned back against him, trusting his strength. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he told her quietly, "and try to move with the horse, not against him. It will hurt less." She nodded, gripping the horn with both hands. He nudged Swift Elk into a trot, heading away from the main road and toward the river. Behind them, Copper Gulch began to wake smoke rising from chimneys, voices calling. But they were already gone, swallowed by the prairie dawn. They followed the river instead of the road, staying low where the banks provided some cover, and the sound of water would mask the horses' hooves. The air smelled of damp earth and sage, fresh and clean after the dust and smoke of town. Rosalie's ribs ached with every jolt, pain stabbing through her chest with each step the horse took, but she gritted her teeth and said nothing. She had learned in the weeks since arriving in this harsh country that complaining achieved nothing. Behind them, as the sun cleared the horizon and painted the sky orange and gold, the town began to stir in earnest. Dan's men saddled horses in the livery stable, moving fast on orders barked by the boss himself. Sheriff Miles drafted a deputy and 3 riders, all armed with rifles and revolvers, all men who knew how to use them. By the time the sun was fully up, they were on the trail, following tracks that were easy to read in the soft earth near the river. Wicasa heard them before he saw them, hoofbeats in the distance, growing louder, the rhythm unmistakable. 4 or 5 horses moving fast. He urged Swift Elk into a faster pace, feeling Rosalie gasp as the motion jarred her ribs, but she clung to the saddle horn and did not complain. A shot cracked behind them, the sound sharp and flat in the morning air. The bullet kicked up sand 20 yards to their left, a puff of dust marking its impact. Another shot followed closer this time, the bullet whining past overhead. "They are shooting to scare us, not to kill," Wicasa said, his voice calm. "They want you alive, but they will shoot the horse if they can." Rosalie's hands tightened on the saddle horn until her knuckles went white. Wicasa veered toward the river, guiding Swift Elk down a steep bank that made Rosalie's stomach lurch. The bank sloped, sharply rocky and treacherous, covered with loose stones that shifted underfoot. He guided the horse, carefully trusting the animal's instincts. Swift Elk picked his way down and then splashed into the shallow water at the edge, the current pulling at his legs. The river was cold, fed by snowmelt from mountains far to the west. The current was stronger than it looked, the water deceptively deep in places where the bottom dropped away without warning. Water splashed up, soaking Rosalie's torn skirt and what remained of her petticoats, the cold shocking after the heat of the sun. Her boot snagged on a submerged root hidden beneath the surface, and she nearly tumbled sideways out of the saddle. Wicasa grabbed her belt with his free hand and yanked her upright, pulling hard enough that she gasped. Then he reached down and drew his knife, slicing through the waterlogged fabric that tangled around her legs. The cut cloth floated away downstream, dark and shapeless. Rosalie felt the air on her legs through her thin undergarments and felt shame, but pushed it aside. Modesty was a luxury she could not afford. Behind them, the riders reached the riverbank and hesitated. Their horses shied from the water, smelling danger ears pinned back. One man, braver or more foolish than the others, urged his mount forward. The horse stepped in, slipped on a stone slick with algae, and nearly went down, front legs buckling. The rider cursed and pulled back hard on the reins, dragging the animal back to the bank. Wicasa pressed on, guiding Swift Elk deeper, then along the channel where the water ran fast, but not too deep. He aimed for a low rock outcrop that jutted out over the river, creating a natural overhang. The shadow beneath it was deep and cool. He reined the horse to a stop under the overhang and listened, pressing Rosalie forward against the horse's neck so they would be less visible. The riders argued on the bank, their voices carrying over the water. One wanted to follow, insisting they could catch up. Another said it was suicide to go into the river on horseback, that they should ride downstream and find an easier crossing. A third voice, belonging to the deputy, said they should split up and cover both banks. After a tense minute that felt much longer, they made their decision. 3 riders turned downstream, heading for a ford half a mile away. One stayed on the bank, watching his rifle across his saddle. Wicasa waited, counting heartbeats, feeling Rosalie's chest rise and fall against his arm. When enough time had passed, he urged Swift Elk forward again, moving slowly to minimize noise. They emerged from the overhang and continued upriver, staying in the water where their tracks would not show, moving away from the riders rather than toward them. They came out of the river miles upstream, dripping and cold despite the growing heat of the day. The sun was higher now, beating down with force. Rosalie shivered, her whole body shaking, teeth chattering. Wicasa stopped long enough to pull a blanket from his pack and drape it over her shoulders, wrapping her as best he could. "We will rest soon," he told her. "Not long, but enough." "How far to Eagle's Nest?" Her voice was hoarse. "2 days if we push. Maybe less if the horses we left behind give up the chase." Rosalie nodded, though her face was pale beneath the bruises. "I can push. I've come this far. I won't quit now." They rode on, putting distance between themselves and Copper Gulch. By midday, the heat was brutal, the sun a hammer that drove down on them without mercy. Rosalie's shivering had stopped, replaced by a feverish flush that worried Wicasa. He felt her forehead with the back of his hand. It was hot, too hot. "We need shelter," he said. "You need rest, real rest." He remembered the old line shack near the abandoned silver mine, the place where Sven and Tallulah had moved after the river camp grew too exposed. It was not far, maybe an hour's ride. They could rest there at least for a while. They reached it as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. The shack was small and weathered walls made of rough-cut timber, silvered by age and weather. The roof sagged in the middle where a beam had cracked, but it still kept out most of the rain. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney made of stacked stones, a thin gray line against the bright sky. Tallulah stepped out as they approached, rifle in her hands, ready. When she saw Wicasa, she lowered the weapon and called back into the shack. Sven appeared in the doorway, leaning on his crutch, his face creased with concern. "Trouble?" Tallulah asked, though the answer was obvious. "Always," Wicasa said, dismounting and then helping Rosalie down. She nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground and he had to catch her and hold her upright. Sven took one look at Rosalie's bruises, the fever in her eyes, and the letter Wikasa handed him, and understood without needing explanations. He studied the letter for a long moment, frowning at the emblem. Tallulah brought Rosalie inside and laid her on a narrow cot, pushed against one wall. The interior of the shack was dim and cool, a relief after the brutal sun. She began preparing a broth from dried meat, wild onions, and herbs she had gathered, working quickly and efficiently. The smell filled the small space, rich and savory. Wikasa unsaddled Swift Elk and rubbed the horse down with handfuls of dry grass, checking his legs and hooves for injury. Finding none, he let the animal drink from a bucket of water drawn from the river, then tied him in the shade where he could rest. He joined Sven at the rough wooden table inside, sitting down heavily. The older man was still studying the letter, his expression troubled. "This emblem," Sven said quietly. "I've seen it before. Last summer. A wagon came through heading east along the rail line. They said they were transporting supplies for the railroad, but the crates were marked fragile, and I heard children crying inside. I asked what they were carrying, and the driver told me to mind my own business in a way that made it clear asking again would be unhealthy." Wikasa's jaw tightened, muscles jumping beneath the skin. "Where did the wagon go?" "East, toward the main line. I watched it until it was out of sight. Never saw it come back." Tallulah brought the broth to Rosalie, helping her sit up enough to sip from a tin cup. Color began to return to the young woman's face slowly as the hot liquid settled in her stomach. She looked at Wikasa across the small room. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice stronger than before. "You didn't have to do this. You don't even know me." "No one should be property," Wikasa said, echoing his earlier words. "And I know enough." She nodded, accepting that, and drank more broth. That night, as Rosalie fought down waves of nausea and tried to sleep, Wikasa sketched a rough map on the table in charcoal taken from the fire. He marked Copper Gulch, the river, the rail line running west. He traced the route to Eagle's Nest, marking landmarks. He knew a distinctive rock formation, a dried creek bed, a stand of cottonwoods near a spring. Prairie stretch with no cover, then the river ford, then the rail line again near Eagle's Nest, where freight trains ran 3 times a day. Rosalie, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, came to the table. She moved slowly, one hand pressed to her ribs, and looked at the map. She traced the rail line with her finger, her nail leaving a faint mark in the charcoal. "This is the same line that brought me here," she said softly. "From New York to Chicago, then west. I rode for 10 days in passenger cars, then they put me in a freight car for the last stretch. No windows, just darkness and the sound of wheels. I thought I was going to die in there." "You did not die," Wikasa said. "You jumped instead. That took courage. Or desperation. I'm not sure there's a difference." He met her eyes. "There is. Desperation is drowning. Courage is swimming even when you do not know where the shore is." She studied his face, seeing something there that made her nod slowly. "Where did you learn to speak English so well?" "Most of the Lakota I've seen in Copper Gulch speak broken English at best." "Missionaries," Wikasa said. "When I was young, before I became a warrior, missionaries came to our band. They wanted to teach us about their God and their ways. My father let them stay because he believed we needed to understand the white world if we were to survive in it. I learned to read and write. I learned their language and their laws. It has been useful, though not in the ways my father hoped." "What happened to him?" "He died 5 winters ago. Fever. The same fever that took my wife and son." Wikasa's voice was calm, but there was a depth of pain beneath it that he did not try to hide. "The traders brought sickness with their goods. We had no resistance to their diseases. Many died that winter. "I'm sorry," Rosalie said and meant it. "It is the way of things now. The world changes, and we must change or die." Rosalie looked back at the map. "So the same steel that carried me into hell might carry me out if we reach Eagle's Nest. If we reach the Marshal and he believes us," Wikasa corrected. "That is not certain." "Nothing is certain," Rosalie said. "But it's more hope than I had yesterday." A shadow crossed the window, visible through gaps in the boards. Sven saw it first, his head snapping up. Down! The windows shattered, inward glass, and wood splinters flying. Gunfire erupted, bullets punching through the walls with sharp cracks that filled the air with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of splintering wood. Wikasa grabbed the rifle Sven shoved at him and returned fire through the gaps in the boards, aiming at muzzle flashes in the darkness outside. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Outside, men shouted orders. Dan's scouts had tracked Swift Elk's prints to the shack following where the riverbank had dried and the soft earth held clear marks. They had waited for nightfall to attack, hoping to catch their quarry asleep. Tallulah pulled Rosalie to the floor, covering her body with her own, and dragged her toward the back of the shack where the walls were thicker. Sven braced the door with his shoulder, pushing his weight against it, despite his bad leg, his face twisted with effort. His crutch clattered to the floor. Wikasa fired carefully, making each shot count, conserving ammunition. He drove the attackers back from the windows, forcing them toward the mouth of the old mine, where the darkness was deeper and cover was better for them, but also limited their field of fire. "We can't hold them here," Sven said, his voice tight with pain. "There are too many, and they'll burn us out if they get smart." Wikasa made a decision quickly, weighing options and finding only one that might work. "The mine. There's a back way out through the old tunnels. I scouted it last year." "Those tunnels aren't safe," Tallulah protested. "The timbers are rotten." "Safer than staying here to be killed or captured." They moved fast, abandoning the shack. Wikasa led Rosalie and Tallulah through a narrow passage into the mine, pushing through darkness that smelled of damp stone and decay. Sven followed, limping badly, rifle in hand, turning back every few steps to watch the entrance. The tunnels were slick with moisture that seeped through cracks in the rock, and the timbers overhead creaked ominously with every step protesting the weight of the mountain above. Behind them, one of Dan's men threw a bundle into the main shaft canvas, wrapped around black powder taken from a mining supply cache, with a fuse made of twisted cloth. The explosion ripped through the mine with a force that knocked them all off their feet, the sound overwhelming ears ringing in the aftermath. Dust and rock fragments rained down. Timbers groaned and snapped. A support beam gave way with a crack like a cannon shot, and rock crashed down, pinning Sven's already injured leg beneath its weight. He cried out a sound of pure agony and dropped the rifle. It clattered away into darkness. Tallulah knelt beside him, trying to lift the beam with her bare hands, but it would not budge. It was too heavy, too much weight for one person. Wikasa could have pushed on with Rosalie and Tallulah. The exit was close, maybe 50 yards through the side tunnel. They could escape, save themselves, leave Sven behind to whatever fate awaited him. It would have been the smart choice, the survivor's choice. He turned back instead. He jammed his shoulders under the fallen beam, feeling the rough wood dig into his skin through his shirt, and planted his feet wide on the slick stone floor. "Pull him!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. Tallulah grabbed Sven under the arms. Rosalie, moving despite her own pain, grabbed his other side. Together they pulled while Wikasa lifted his muscles, straining until they felt like they might tear his knees, buckling with the effort. The beam shifted barely just enough. They dragged Sven free, his leg bloody and twisted at an unnatural angle, boot torn half off. Wikasa held the beam until they were clear, until his vision started to go dark at the edges. then let it drop them and stumbled after them, gasping for air that tasted of dust and blood. They reached a narrow side tunnel that angled upward toward the cliff face, where erosion had created a small opening. Lantern light from the attackers flickered in the main shaft behind them, growing brighter. They moved faster, half-dragging Sven, his face gray with pain and shock. The opening was tight, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. One by one they crawled out onto a rocky ledge above the river, the stone cold and rough under their hands. The drop to the water below was 20 feet, not fatal if you hit it right, deadly if you didn't. They eased along the ledge backs, pressed to the cliff face, feeling for handholds in the darkness. Behind them in the mine timbers continued to collapse the sound like distant thunder. Dan's men retreated, coughing and cursing, driven back by falling rock and choking dust. At the end of the ledge, a tumble of boulders provided a way down to the riverbank. They scrambled down one at a time, Wikasa going first and then helping the others. Sven could barely move his leg useless, and they had to lower him carefully to keep from causing more damage. They crouched by the riverbank, covered in dust that turned to mud, where sweat and river spray touched their skin. Hearts pounded. Breath came hard. They were alive, but barely, and they had lost the horse, the supplies, everything except the clothes on their backs and the weapons they carried. "We can't go back to the shack," Tallulah said, stating the obvious. "They'll be watching it." "No," Wikasa agreed. "We go forward, to Eagle's Nest. It's the only chance now." "Sven can't ride," Rosalie said. "Not with that leg." "Then he stays here hidden while we go for help," Wikasa said. "It's not ideal, but there is no ideal. Only choices between bad and worse." Sven gritted his teeth and nodded. "Go, I'll be fine. Tallulah can tend the leg and we'll hide in the rocks. Go get that marshal and bring him back with enough men to arrest Dan and his whole cursed operation." They moved Sven to a hidden spot beneath an overhang, where the river had carved a shallow cave over countless years. The space was dry, sheltered from view, with a clear line of sight to anyone approaching from upstream or down. Tallulah stayed with him, binding his leg as best she could, with strips torn from her own skirt, packing the wound with herbs to fight infection. She had her rifle and a knife, and she knew how to use both. Wikasa and Rosalie continued on foot, moving through the night. They had lost Swift Elk in the chaos. The horse had bolted when the shooting started and was likely halfway back to the river camp by now. They walked, putting one foot in front of the other, moving away from danger and toward an uncertain hope. The night was long and cold. Stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Rosalie stumbled, often her strength fading, but each time Wikasa steadied her and urged her on. They spoke little, saving their breath for walking. But there was a kind of understanding growing between them, forged in shared danger and mutual dependence. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink, Rosalie finally spoke. "Why are you doing this, really? You barely know me, and you've lost everything helping me. Your horse, your supplies, your safety. Why?" Wikasa was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun rise. "Because I saw what the white world does to those it considers property. I saw children taken and never returned. I saw my people forced onto land that cannot support them, given promises that turn to dust. I saw my wife and son die from sickness brought by traders who cared only for profit. I cannot stop all of it. I cannot turn back time or change the treaties or bring back the buffalo herds. But I can stop one man from selling one woman like she is livestock. That is something. Maybe it is small, but it is something I can do." Rosalie nodded slowly, tears tracking through the dust on her face. "Thank you. I don't have better words than that, but thank you." "You do not need better words. Keep walking. Eagle's Nest is not far now." By mid-morning, they could see the town in the distance, a cluster of buildings crouched between brown hills. The rail junction where two lines met, where freight trains came through every few hours, carrying goods and people west and east. Smoke rose from chimneys. The distant sound of a train whistle carried on the wind, lonely and metallic. They reached the edge of town, exhausted, covered in dust and dried mud, moving like people twice their age. People stared as they made their way down the main street toward the marshal's office. But no one stopped them. A Lakota man and a white woman in torn clothes were strange enough that folks preferred to watch from a distance rather than get involved. The marshal's office sat at the end of the street, a small building with barred windows and a hitching post out front. The door stood open, and they could see inside to a desk and a gun rack on the wall. But something was wrong. Black ribbon draped the doorway, tied in a bow that fluttered slightly in the breeze, the universal sign of death and mourning. They stepped inside. A young man sat at the desk, nervous-looking with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He looked up when they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of them. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "We need to see Marshal Harlan," Wakasa said. "It is urgent." The young man's face fell. "I'm sorry. The marshal is... he died 3 days ago. There was a robbery at one of the freight offices. He responded and was shot. At least, that's the official story." Wakasa felt his heart sink like a stone dropped in deep water. "What is the unofficial story?" The clerk glanced at the door, then leaned forward and spoke quietly. "Some folks think it wasn't a robbery at all. Think maybe someone wanted the marshal dead because he was asking too many questions about the orphan trains and the contract labor schemes. But no one can prove anything, and the railroad company says it was just bad luck. I'm Ulysses, by the way. I'm the telegraph operator and temporary deputy until they send someone new." Rosalie leaned heavily on Wikasa's arm, her strength finally giving out completely. He guided her to a chair, and she sat down hard, her face gray. "What do we do now?" she asked, despair creeping into her voice. Wikasa thought quickly, running through options. Harlan had a contact at Fort Laramie, a federal agent who was working with him on the investigation. "If I can send a message..." Ulysses nodded eagerly, seeming relieved to have something concrete to do. "I can send a telegram. What do you want to say?" Wikasa dictated a coded message using phrases he and Harlan had agreed on years before, when Wikasa had first started scouting for the government. He spoke of orphans on the rails and contract brides, and mentioned the name Crow Dan and Bartholomew both. He gave their location and requested immediate assistance. Ulysses tapped it out on the telegraph key, his fingers moving quickly over the brass contacts. But as he worked, his other hand lingered near a second key mounted under the counter, partially hidden from view. Wikasa noticed, but said nothing, watching carefully. When Ulysses finished, he looked up. "It'll take a day or two to get a reply, maybe longer. The agent might be in the field. What will you do in the meantime?" "Rest," Wikasa said. "Find food and water. Wait. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Clean enough, and the proprietor doesn't ask too many questions." They left the office and made their way to the boarding house, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and a sign that read, "Rooms available, weekly, monthly." The proprietor was a gray-haired woman who took one look at them and named a price that was fair. Wikasa paid with coins from a small pouch at his belt, money he had saved from scouting work. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. Rosalie collapsed onto the bed and was asleep within minutes, her body finally shutting down to heal itself. Wikasa stood at the window and watched the street below his mind, working through possibilities and dangers. Something about the telegraph operator had bothered him, but he could not quite name what. Outside near the train depot, he spotted a wagon marked with the Thunder Valley Railroad emblem, the same emblem from Rosalie's letter. Crates sat stacked in the wagon bed, numbered and marked. A man in a dark coat stood nearby, checking numbers against a slim leather ledger, his movements precise and businesslike. Wicasa studied the man's face and recognized him from descriptions Rosalie had given. Bartholomew Crow, Dan's brother, the man who had signed the letter promising marriage and a future, and had delivered neither. He watched as Bartholomew checked each crate, methodically making notes with a pencil. The numbering style on the crates was familiar. Wicasa had seen similar markings on the boxes used to transport Lakota children east the year before. The same system, the same organization. The pieces snapped together in his mind with sudden terrible clarity. Bartholomew's mail-order bride business and the orphan train placements were not separate operations. They were part of one network, one system designed to move human cargo women and children to places where they could be exploited for labor or worse. The contracts and adoption papers provided legal cover, making it all look respectable while hiding the truth beneath. They were not just running from a cruel saloon owner and a corrupt sheriff. They were standing at the edge of a rail-wide trafficking network that stretched from New York to the frontier, protected by money and lawyers and the respectable facade of the railroad company itself. The realization was both terrifying and clarifying. If they could expose this network, if they could provide enough evidence to bring it down, and they might save not just Rosalie, but countless others. But the danger had just multiplied tenfold, because men with that much to lose would kill to protect it. That night, as Rosalie slept, the exhausted sleep of the injured and traumatized Wicasa sat by the window and kept watch. Near midnight, he saw Ulysses leave the marshal's office and hurry down the street to the telegraph office, a separate building near the depot. Lamplight showed briefly in the window and then went dark. An hour later, a reply came clicking through on the wires, and Ulysses emerged, read a paper in his hand, and hurried off into the night toward the boarding house where the railroad officials stayed. Wicasa's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Ulysses had sent another message, one using the private line hidden under the counter. Dan Crow would know they were in Eagle's Nest within hours, maybe already knew. They had walked into a trap without realizing it. He woke Rosalie gently, his hand on her shoulder. "We need to leave. Now." She sat up disoriented. "What, why?" "The telegraph operator. I think he sent word to Dan. We are not safe here." Rosalie's face went pale in the dim lamplight. "Where do we go? We can't outrun them on foot." "Back to Copper Gulch." Wicasa said the plan forming even as he spoke. "They will not expect us to go back, and the orphan train is due to arrive tomorrow. Edith and Dr. Kingsley will be there trying to protect the children from men like Orville. If we can reach them, gather evidence, maybe we can stop this before more children are sold." "That's insane," Rosalie said. "We barely escaped with our lives." "Yes. But sometimes the only way forward is back. Are you strong enough?" She met his eyes, saw the determination there, and found an echo of it in herself. "I'll have to be." They left through the window, dropping to the alley below and moving through shadows toward the edge of town. Behind them, lights began to appear in windows as men were roused from sleep. Shouts echoed through the streets. But by then, Wicasa and Rosalie were gone, swallowed by the prairie night, heading east toward the rising sun and the dangers they had fled from. The journey back to Copper Gulch took 2 days of hard travel on foot, moving at night and hiding during the day to avoid patrols. They ate sparingly from what little food Wicasa could scavenge. Prairie turnips dug from the earth, Wild onions, a rabbit he killed with a thrown stone and cooked over a tiny fire that produced almost no smoke. Rosalie learned to walk despite the pain in her ribs, learned to move quietly through grass that could hide them or betray them, depending on how carefully they stepped. During the long hours of walking, they talked in low voices, sharing pieces of their pasts that made them more real to each other. Rosalie told him about growing up in New York, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had died of cholera when she was 15, leaving her alone in a city that ground up the weak and helpless. She had worked in a textile factory for 3 years, her hands growing calloused and scarred from the looms, until the factory burned and she was out on the street again. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like salvation, a chance to escape the city and start fresh. "I should have known it was too good to be true," she said bitterly as they rested in the shade of a rock outcrop. "But I wanted to believe so badly. I wanted to think there was a place where someone wanted me for more than the work I could do." "That wanting is not a weakness," Wakasa said. "It is what makes us human. The men who exploited it are the ones at fault, not you." Rosalie looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the buckskin and the long hair to the man beneath. "You've lost people too. I can hear it in your voice when you speak about your wife and son." "Yes, 5 winters ago. The fever came with the traders and it spread through our camp like wildfire. We had no medicine that could fight it, no immunity. My son died first. He was only 2 summers old. My wife followed 3 days later. I buried them both on the hill above the river and sang the death songs, as is our custom. Then I left the camp because I could not bear to stay in the place where they had died." "I'm sorry," Rosalie said quietly. "I know those words don't help, but I don't have better ones. They help more than you know. Shared grief is lighter than grief carried alone." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the prairie wind moving through the grass around them with a sound like distant waves. Then they moved on because staying still meant death, and they were not ready to die yet. They reached Copper Gulch as the sun climbed high on the second day, approaching from the north through broken country that offered cover. The town looked the same as it had when they left, rough, sun-baked, indifferent to the human dramas playing out within its borders. But the train was at the station, steam hissing from its valves, smoke rising from its stack. The orphan train had arrived. Children pressed their faces to the windows of the passenger car, their expressions a mixture of hope and fear and exhaustion. They had ridden for weeks across the country, collected from orphanages and street corners, promised families and futures that might or might not materialize. On the platform, Edith stood with a clipboard in her hands, her face set in lines of determination. Beside her, Dr. Kingsley looked tired and older than he had just days ago, his face still bruised from Dan's earlier blow. But Orville was there too, flanked by 2 ranch hands, who looked more like gunmen than cowboys. And Sheriff Miles, wearing his badge and his revolver, backing Orville's claim to whatever children he wanted. Wakasa and Rosalie crouched behind a stack of lumber near the depot, watching. They saw Orville point at 3 children, 2 boys who looked strong enough for hard labor, and a girl with Lakota features who stood quietly, eyes downcast. Edith stepped forward, her voice carrying across the platform. "These children are not livestock, Mr. Orville. They go to families I approve of, families that have been investigated and found suitable." Orville smiled, the expression cold. "I am a family. I have a ranch, land, resources. I can provide for them better than most folks in this territory. That's all the law requires." Dr. Kingsley spoke up, his voice shaking with anger. "You'll work them to death in your fields and call it character building. Everyone knows what happens to children who go to your ranch. They're never seen again." The deputy standing beside Miles stepped forward without warning and smashed the butt of his revolver across Kingsley's face. The doctor dropped into the dust like a felled tree blood streaming from his nose and mouth. His spectacles flew off and shattered on the boards. Edith screamed. The children on the train cried out, pressing back from the windows. Orville grabbed the Lakota girl, Bly was her name, by the arm and began dragging her toward his wagon, ignoring her struggles. Then Wicasa stood up from behind the lumber pile and walked forward, his rifle in his hands. His voice rang out across the platform, clear and commanding. "Let her go." Everyone turned. Orville's face went from confident to uncertain in the space of a heartbeat. Miles reached for his revolver, then stopped when he saw the rifle already aimed in his direction. "You're a wanted man, Lakota," Miles said, trying to regain control. "You got no authority here. In fact, I'm placing you under arrest right now." "Then arrest me after I kill you," Wicasa said calmly. "Because that is what will happen if you draw that weapon. I am a good shot, and at this distance, I will not miss." Rosalie stepped out from behind him, holding a revolver she had taken from an unconscious guard they had ambushed on the edge of town. Her hands were steady despite everything, and she aimed at the deputy who had struck Dr. Kingsley. "2 guns," she said. "2 of you. Bad odds." Miles hesitated, calculating. Orville released Bly and backed toward his wagon, his courage evaporating. The ranch hands watched, but did not move clearly, unwilling to die for their employer's ambitions. Edith hurried forward and gathered Bly and the 2 boys, ushering them away from Orville and toward a wagon she had prepared. Dr. Kingsley staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his face, and Rosalie helped him into the wagon while keeping her revolver trained on the deputy. "We're taking these children to Fort Laramie," Edith announced loudly, making sure everyone heard. "The Army will protect them until proper placements can be arranged. Anyone who tries to stop us will answer to federal authorities." She climbed into the driver's seat and took up the reins. The wagon lurched forward, rolling away from the station. Wicasa and Rosalie backed away, covering them, not lowering their weapons, until the wagon had cleared the edge of town. Then they turned and ran, sprinting for the broken country to the north, knowing pursuit would come fast and hard. They were right. Within minutes, riders poured out of Copper Gulch, led by Dan himself, his face twisted with rage. He had returned from Eagle's Nest that morning, having received Ulysses's message, and now he had been humiliated in front of the whole town. He would not let that stand. The chase was brutal and relentless. Wicasa and Rosalie ran through gullies and over ridges, using every bit of cover the land provided, but the riders were mounted and fresh, while they were on foot and exhausted. Shots cracked behind them, bullets kicking up dust. They reached a narrow canyon where the walls rose steep on both sides, and there they found Edith's wagon blocking the road. The front axle had snapped, the wheel tilted at an impossible angle. The wagon had fallen sideways, spilling children and supplies into the dirt. Edith was on the ground, trying to get the children to cover her face, pale with fear. Dan's riders appeared on the ridge above, cutting off any escape. They were trapped. Wicasa took position behind a boulder, checking his rifle. He had maybe a dozen rounds left. Not enough, but it would have to be. Rosalie crouched beside him, her revolver ready, and met his eyes. "No matter what happens," she said, "thank you for trying." "It is not over yet," Wicasa said. "We are not dead yet." Bullets sparked off the rocks around them. One round grazed Wicasa's upper arm, tearing through his shirt and leaving a hot line of pain that made him grunt, but not drop the rifle. He switched it to his other shoulder and kept firing, making each shot count. The children huddled behind the overturned wagon, crying. Edith tried to calm them, but her voice shook with fear that no amount of determination could hide. Wicasa knew they could not hold this position. The canyon was a trap, and Dan had all the time in the world to wait them out, or flank them, or simply charge and overwhelm them with numbers. He needed a place where the terrain favored the defenders, where numbers mattered less. He remembered the trestle bridge where the rail line crossed a roaring river not far to the west. Narrow, exposed, deadly, but a choke point where a few could hold off many if they were brave or desperate enough. "We move," he said to Rosalie and Edith. "The trestle bridge. It's our only chance." "That's insane," Edith said. "We'll be completely exposed." "We are completely exposed here. At least there we can control the approach. Help me get the children moving." They scrambled up a side gulch that angled away from the main canyon, moving as fast as the youngest children could manage. Edith carried one boy on her hip. Rosalie lifted Bly onto her back, despite the pain it caused her ribs and climbed lungs burning. Wikasa and a limping figure who appeared from the rocks, Sven, who had somehow made his way here with Tallulah's help refusing to hide, while others fought, covered them with slow, careful shots that kept the pursuers at bay, but did not stop them. They reached the rail line just as a distant whistle echoed through the hills. A freight train was approaching from the east, right on schedule, indifferent to the human drama about to unfold on the bridge ahead. The trestle bridge stretched over a foaming gorge, a skeletal structure of wood and iron that looked impossibly fragile against the vast emptiness below. The river churned white around jagged rocks 100 feet down, and the drop was dizzying. Wind pulled at their clothes and hair as they stepped onto the first boards. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for the train tracks, with cross ties spaced to accommodate iron wheels, not human feet. The gaps between ties revealed the drop below, and the whole structure swayed slightly in the wind, groaning and creaking like a living thing in pain. Wikasa ordered Edith and the two younger boys to crawl along the outer beam, clinging to the rail and not looking down. They moved slowly, inch by inch, fingers white-knuckled on the iron. Sven followed on hands and knees, dragging his injured leg, his face twisted with agony, but his jaw set with determination. Rosalie and Bly moved near the center with Wikasa, picking their way over the ties. Each step was a negotiation with balance and fear. The wind pulled at them, and the sound of the river below was a constant roar that filled the air and made communication difficult. Behind them, Dan and his riders reached the near end of the trestle. The lead horse, a big bay, balked at the open structure, planting its feet and refusing to move forward despite the spur. The animal could sense the danger, could smell death in the wind, and no amount of force would make it step onto those boards. Dan cursed his voice, carrying over the wind, and swung out of his saddle. Two men followed him, revolvers drawn, stepping onto the bridge on foot. Their boots clattered on the narrow boards, the sound echoing. Gunfire erupted across the span. Wikasa ducked behind a support post and traded rounds with Dan's men, aiming carefully, making each bullet count. A shot chipped the wood near Rosalie's shoulder, sending splinters flying. She flinched, but raised her revolver and fired back, forcing one of the gunmen to flatten himself against the ties. The freight train's engine rounded the curve, its headlamp glaring like an angry sun. The whistle screamed a long, wailing note that spoke of weight and momentum and unstoppable force. The whole bridge began to vibrate with the approach of the massive locomotive. Near the copper gulch end of the bridge, partially hidden behind a support structure, sat a track switch lever that controlled a siding at the station. If Wikasa could reach it, he could divert the train off the main line and onto the siding, sending it away from the trestle. If he failed, the locomotive would smash through everyone on the span, killing them all without even slowing down. He looked at Rosalie, and in that moment, a whole conversation passed between them without words. She understood what he needed to do, understood the risk, understood that someone had to keep Dan's men occupied while he made the attempt. "Keep them looking at you," he said simply. She nodded, stepping out from behind cover and firing twice, deliberately missing, but forcing the gunmen to take cover and return fire. Her shots echoed across the gorge, mixing with the roar of water and the growing thunder of the approaching train. Wikasa bolted along the ties, leaping gaps with measured, careful strides. His arms spread wide for balance, and he did not look down, keeping his eyes fixed on the far end where the lever waited. The boards shook beneath his feet with the vibration of the oncoming train. Behind him, he heard more shots, heard Rosalie's revolver click empty. Dan saw his intent and charged after him, boots slipping on the narrow boards. One of Dan's men following close behind stumbled. His leg plunged through the gap between ties, and he hung there suspended over the gorge, screaming and clawing at the wood. Then a board splintered under his weight, and he fell, his scream cutting off abruptly as he hit the water and was swallowed by the churning foam. The death was brutal and fast, a reminder of the stakes, and it slowed the other gunmen, who hung back suddenly, unwilling to follow. Wikasa reached the lever and threw his weight against it. The mechanism was old, the gears rusted from exposure to weather, and it resisted. He pushed harder, muscles straining, boots sliding on the boards. The rails began to shift with a grinding shriek of metal on metal moving reluctantly. Dan slammed into him from behind the impact, driving the air from Wikasa's lungs. The two men crashed onto the ties, grappling. Dan's revolver skidded away between them, just out of reach of both. They fought with fists and elbows and knees, body weight, and leveraged the only weapons that mattered. Dan was heavier, but Wikasa was stronger, and they rolled perilously close to the edge where there was nothing between them and the rocks below. The train's thunder built until the whole bridge shook, like it was coming apart. The vibration made it impossible to keep footing, and both men struggled just to stay on the boards. Rosalie saw Dan's hand closing around the revolver, fingers touching the grip. She had no clear shot. Wikasa was too close, and she had no bullets left anyway. She spotted a short crowbar left near a support brace by track workers, the kind used to pry up nails and shift rails. Moving as quickly as her bruised body would allow, she dropped her empty revolver and grabbed the crowbar. Then she stepped out onto the narrow beam beside the tracks, moving sideways, eyes fixed on Dan. The wind pulled at her torn dress. The drop yawned below her like an open mouth. Her ribs screamed with pain at every breath. But she kept moving one step at a time until she was close enough. At the last moment, as Dan wrenched the revolver free and swung it toward Wikasa's head, Rosalie swung the crowbar with all the strength she had left. The iron bar connected with Dan's shoulder with a sound like a breaking branch. The blow knocked him sideways, and his revolver fired the shot, going wild, the bullet striking a support post and ricocheting away into nothing. Dan's boot slid off the edge. He teetered there for one long moment, arms windmilling, his face twisted with sudden terror. Then gravity took him, and he fell tumbling through the air, his body spinning once, twice, before it hit the rocks below with an impact that was lost in the roar of the river. The bridge held. The diverted freight roared onto the siding instead of the trestle, its brakes screaming as the engineer fought to slow the massive weight. Steam vented in white plumes that turned to mist in the wind. Wikasa lay on the board's chest, heaving, one arm bleeding where Dan had clawed him. Rosalie crouched beside him, still holding the crowbar, her knuckles white on the iron. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Wikasa sat up slowly, painfully, and Rosalie helped him to his feet. Behind them, Dan's remaining men retreated, their leader gone, their courage evaporated. The fight was over. The freight train squealed into Copper Gulch Station under a red sunset, steam rolling across the platform in thick clouds. Townsfolk gathered in confusion, drawn by the gunshots and the commotion, unsure what was happening, but unwilling to miss it. Along the trackside, Wikasa, Rosalie, Edith, Sven, Bly, and the two boys limped toward the depot. They were covered in dust and blood, their clothes torn, their faces marked by exhaustion and pain. Rosalie's knees finally failed completely, too bruised and damaged to support her weight any longer. She crumpled onto the boards, unable to take another step. Wicasa dropped down beside her, his back against the depot wall, and drew her into his arms, shielding her from the crowd's boots and chaos. It mirrored the opening moment, the Lakota warriors seated on the bleached platform. Buckskin torn and dusty hair, loose around his shoulders, the battered woman held against his chest for protection rails, stretching into the glowing distance behind them. Sheriff Miles strode forward, pistol drawn, his face red with anger and something that might have been fear. "You're under arrest. Tall Bear kidnapping, murder, destruction of railroad property, resisting arrest." "Shut up, Miles." The voice came from behind him. Tallulah stood there, having driven a wagon into town, and in the bed lay Sven, pale but alive, his leg splinted. Beside the wagon stood several townspeople who had gathered to listen. Sven spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice strong despite his injuries. "It was Dan Crow's men who blew the mine with black powder, not Wicasa. I was there. I saw it. And Wicasa saved my life when the roof came down, held up a beam so I could be pulled out. That's not the action of a criminal. That's the action of a hero." Dr. Kingsley staggered forward from the crowd, his face still bruised and swollen from the deputy's blow. He held up a bundle of papers he had found earlier, tied with string. "I found these in Dan's saddlebags, brought back by one of his men who got hurt in the canyon fight. It's a ledger. Lists names, amounts, paid services rendered. Orville's name is in here a dozen times, paying for contract brides and apprentice boys, all bearing the Thunder Valley Railroad emblem." He held up one of the papers so everyone could see the familiar emblem stamped at the top. Edith testified next, her voice shaking but clear. "Orville tried to buy children from the orphan train, by force, backed by Sheriff Miles. When Dr. Kingsley objected, the deputy struck him down. These children," she gestured to Bly and the two boys huddling close to her, "would have been sold into labor or worse if Wicasa and Rosalie hadn't stopped it." Bly, small and frightened, but determined, pointed a shaking finger at Orville, who stood at the edge of the crowd, trying to blend into the shadows. "He looked at me like I was a horse he was buying. He said I'd work hard or he'd beat me until I did. I heard him say it." The crowd shifted. Murmurs ran through it like wind through grass. Some people lowered their rifles. Others looked at Miles with new suspicion. The railroad superintendent, a well-dressed man, who had arrived on the diverted freight train, stepped forward. He was sweating despite the cooling evening air, and his face was pale as he took the ledger from Dr. Kingsley and examined it. The emblem on the papers seemed to burn his fingers. This is a company emblem," he said slowly. "If this is real, if Dan and Bartholomew Crow have been using company resources to traffic in human beings, the railroad will cooperate fully with any federal investigation. We cannot be associated with such activities." He turned to Miles. "Sheriff, I'm formally requesting that you surrender your badge pending a full investigation of these allegations. If you refuse, I'll send a telegram to Fort Laramie tonight requesting federal marshals." Miles looked around, seeing the faces turned against him, and for the first time in his career, he looked genuinely afraid. He unpinned his badge slowly and handed it over, saying nothing. Weeks passed. The world did not change overnight, but it began to shift in small ways that accumulated like snowfall building into an avalanche. Federal agents from Fort Laramie arrived with a new marshal, a hard-eyed man who asked questions and took notes and did not accept evasions. Orville's ranch was seized while investigators questioned former hands, several of whom broke down and confessed to witnessing children worked until they collapsed, then buried in unmarked graves on the property. Orville himself was arrested, trying to flee on a southbound train. He would hang before winter came, and few would mourn him. Miles was clapped in irons and loaded onto a prisoner wagon charged with conspiracy, corruption, and accessory to kidnapping and murder. His trial would be short, the evidence overwhelming. Bartholomew Crow was arrested in Eagle's Nest, trying to destroy papers in his office when federal agents kicked in the door. When they searched his locked desk drawers, they found more than just company ledgers. They found copies of letters from dozens of women like Rosalie, all responding to his advertisements, all asking questions that should have been answered, but weren't. And at the bottom of one stack, they found something unexpected: pages in Rosalie's own handwriting, questions she had scribbled at the bottom of her original contract letter before mailing it. Why is no pastor's name given for the wedding? Why must all payment go through a saloon rather than directly to the groom? Why is the bride forbidden from bringing family members? Why are no references provided? Bartholomew had copied her questions and kept them hidden, tucked away, as a private insurance policy. If the operation ever came crashing down, he could use them to show that he had doubts, that he wasn't fully committed, that he deserved leniency. But he had never dared actually send them to anyone who might investigate. Those pages, once turned over to federal lawyers, became key evidence tying the Crows and their partners to a deliberate, systematic trafficking scheme. Rosalie's stubborn skepticism recorded in her own hand, months before she ever boarded that train. West provided proof that the operation relied on deception and exploitation. Without those papers, the case would have stalled at the level of testimony and rumor. With them, it became ironclad. The real surprise, the truth that settled over everyone as the trial proceeded, was this: Rosalie had not been merely a victim rescued by a warrior. Long before she jumped from that moving train, her questions had already carved cracks in the system that would eventually destroy it. Her refusal to simply accept what she was told, her insistence on asking why, had planted seeds of evidence that would grow into the weapon that brought down the entire network. She had saved herself in a way long before Wikasa's hand had pulled her from the edge of those rails. He had given her the chance to survive long enough for that salvation to matter, but the weapon that destroyed her enemies had been forged in her own careful, skeptical handwriting. Back in Copper Gulch, life began to settle into new patterns. Tallulah and Sven, using compensation from the railroad for the destroyed mine and from seized Crow assets divided among victims, opened a small boarding house near the station. It was plain but clean, with good food and fair prices. Travelers spoke well of it, and business was steady. Sven's leg healed slowly, leaving him with a worse limp than before, but he walked without a crutch by late summer and could work again. Dr. Kingsley moved his practice into a cleaner building with proper equipment purchased with donations from grateful families whose children had been saved. Rosalie kept his books, her handwriting firm and neat, her mind quick with figures. She learned quickly and proved so capable that Kingsley paid her a salary that would have shocked the factory owners back in New York. She saved most of it, planning for a future she was only beginning to imagine. Edith took charge of the orphan train stop under new federal rules that required inspection and approval before any child could be placed. She worked closely with the new marshal, and together they created a system that was far from perfect, but much better than what had come before. No child left that platform without her approval, and she was fierce in her defense of them. Bly was placed with a Lakota family near Thunder Valley people who welcomed her and gave her a home. She wrote letters to Rosalie every month, careful block letters that gradually became more confident, telling of her new life and asking questions about Rosalie's. Those letters were treasured, kept in a box that Rosalie stored under her bed. Wikasa stood between worlds, as he always had, but with a clearer purpose now. His band near Thunder Valley that wanted him to return for the buffalo hunts that still happened, though the herds were smaller each year. Federal agents wanted him as scout and interpreter in the ongoing trafficking cases tracking down other networks that surely existed if this one had. He chose a middle road. He would ride trail for months at a time, working for the government and sending money back to support his people. But Copper Gulch would be one of his regular stops, a place to return to between journeys. Down by the slow river, on a warm afternoon in early autumn, when the cottonwood leaves were just beginning to turn gold, Rosalie worked at regaining her balance and strength. Her ribs had healed, the bruises had faded, but she had lost muscle and stamina during the weeks of running and hiding. Wicasa cut a log from a fallen cottonwood, trimmed it smooth, and floated it in a shallow eddy where the current was gentle. He waded out and positioned it carefully, then looked back at Rosalie, where she stood on the bank. "Stand on it," he said. She looked at him like he had lost his mind. "That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard." "Maybe. But try anyway." "Why?" "Because if you can stand on a moving log in a river station, planks and train steps will never own you again. You will know you can balance anywhere, under any conditions. The fear will be gone." Rosalie studied the log and then studied Wicasa's face. He was serious, and beneath the seeming foolishness, she understood the wisdom. It was not about the log. It was about proving to herself that she could stand anywhere, that her body was hers to command, that no one could knock her down, who she did not allow to knock her down. She waded in. The water was cold, fed by distant snowmelt, and it soaked her skirt and made her gasp. She reached the log and climbed up carefully, placing one foot, then the other. The log immediately shifted, rolling slightly, and she nearly tumbled. Wicasa's hands hovered at her waist, not touching, ready to catch her if she truly fell, but not supporting her weight. "Find the center," he said. "Feel where the balance is." She tried, failed, tried again. On the fourth attempt, she stood for nearly 30 seconds before the log rolled and dumped her into the waist-deep water with a splash. She came up sputtering and laughing despite the cold. Wicasa's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Better. Again. They spent an hour at it, the exercise practical and methodical, but there was something else beneath it. The quiet focus with which he watched her, ready but not overbearing, spoke of trust and respect and something deeper that neither of them had words for yet. The way she kept trying despite failure, determined to master this ridiculous task, because he had asked her to spoke of the same thing. When she finally stood on the log for a full minute, arms out for balance, face flushed with triumph, he nodded once. "Good. Now you know you can do anything." "I knew I could do anything before," she said, still balanced on the log. "But thank you for reminding me." He waded out of the river, boots and leggings soaked, and offered her his hand to help her to shore. She took it, and for a moment their fingers intertwined, warm despite the cold water. Neither of them said anything about it, but neither pulled away either. In the final scene, another orphan train pulled into Copper Gulch on a bright October morning, when the air was crisp and clean and the sky was impossibly blue. The leaves on the few trees near the station had turned gold and red, and they rustled in the breeze with a sound like whispered secrets. Children leaned from the windows, wary and hopeful, in equal measure, faces pressed to the glass. They had ridden for weeks, leaving behind everything they knew, heading toward futures they could not imagine. On the platform, Wicasa stood in his plain buckskin hair, tied back with his single eagle feather that caught the morning light. A badge of Federal Scout was pinned discreetly to his vest, the metal gleaming. He wore it not as decoration, but as a tool, a sign of authority that might help protect those who needed protecting. Beside him stood Rosalie, in a simple but clean dress of dark blue fabric, practical and well-made. Her hair pinned up properly for the first time in months. She held a clipboard, working with Edith to match children with families who had been investigated and approved. The train's brakes released with a hiss of steam. The door opened, and a conductor helped the first child down, a small boy clutching a cloth bundle that contained everything he owned in the world. He looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "Are we being sent away again?" he asked in a thin voice that broke on the last word. Rosalie and Wicasa exchanged a glance, a whole conversation passing between them in that look. Then Wicasa stepped forward and knelt down, bringing himself level with the boy's eyes. He did not smile, that would have been false comfort, but his voice was steady and true. "We walk with you this time," he said. "You are not alone. We will make sure you go to a place where you are wanted, where you will be treated well. That is a promise." Rosalie nodded her hand, resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. "You're safe now. That's the truth." The boy looked between them, reading their faces, sensing the conviction there. Slowly, some of the fear left his expression, replaced by cautious hope. Behind him, other children began to disembark, and Edith was there to greet them, checking names against her list, speaking to each one kindly. The new marshal watched from near the depot, ensuring nothing went wrong, his hand resting on his revolver, but his face relaxed. The process was slow and careful, nothing rushed, no corners cut. Each child would be placed properly with families who had been vetted and approved, and each placement would be monitored. It was not perfect, nothing human ever was, but it was so much better than what had come before. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, warming the platform, Wicasa and Rosalie stood side by side, working together with the ease of long practice. They did not touch, did not make declarations, but anyone watching could see the bond between them, forged in danger and tested by fire, as strong as iron and as supple as leather. When the last child had been placed and the last wagon had rolled away toward a new home, when the train had departed and the platform was empty again, they stood together, looking at the rails stretching away into the distance. "What now?" Rosalie asked quietly. "Now we keep working," Wicasa said. "There are more trains coming, more children who need protection, more networks to break apart. The fight is not over." "No," Rosalie agreed, "but we're winning. Yes, slowly, but yes." They turned and walked back toward town. Together, two figures moving through golden afternoon light, their shadows long on the dusty boards. Behind them, the rails stretched toward a harsh but slightly more just horizon, promising journeys yet to come and battles yet to be fought. But for now, in this moment, they had done what they could. They had stopped one evil, saved lives that would otherwise have been destroyed, and proven that even in a world as broken as this one, individuals could make a difference if they had courage enough to stand. The sun moved toward the western hills, and the wind carried the scent of approaching winter. Life would go on hard and unforgiving, as always, but marked now by small victories that might over time accumulate into something larger. Justice, perhaps, or at least the hope of it. And that was enough.